Good morning. I invite you to turn with me in your Old Testaments to the book of 1 Samuel. The book of 1 Samuel, the first chapter. I would take this time to let you know that Michael Lindsay and I have resolved amongst each other to co-teach 1 Samuel next quarter in the Sunday morning auditorium class. And so for the past month or so, I've been reading through and thinking about this deep book, rich text. And so when Chad asked me if I would be willing to speak, he said, just say what's on your heart. And so he caught me camping out in 1 Samuel. So that's where I would like to share, hopefully, an encouraging word from God this morning, and to reflect on Hannah, to reflect on lessons that we can learn in faith, prayer, and general godliness from this godly woman in the Old Testament. And Hannah has two prayers. One prayer in chapter 1, and then her next prayer is in chapter 2, and they're two very different prayers. And Hannah's in two very different stations in life, two very different situations. And I think first, in order to really appreciate either of those prayers, we need to understand her life story. And to begin with the story of Hannah and her family, we really need to understand the book of Judges, because Samuel kicks off in the time period of the Judges in Israel. This book begins on the heels of the book of Judges. And if you remember the book of Judges, that period after the passing of Joshua, who had led Israel after the passing of Moses, when the Israelites were inhabiting the land of Canaan, God had appointed 12 judges over the course of 350 years. These judges were civil, political leaders who were given to help aid the people in their conquest of Canaan. But as we know, the period of the judges was the darkest period in the history of God's people. Moses had warned the Israelites to not mix with the nations. God had warned Israel to remove the inhabitants of Canaan, lest they become just like them. And that's exactly what they did. They mixed with the nations. They became homogenous with the nations. The period of the judges is filled with every sin and vile thing that they could have done. And it was a period of general apostasy and falling away, a complete departure from the law of Moses, from the law that God had given his people in order to not only help them, but to maintain a relationship with him, the holy God. The book of Judges ends with a verse, and it's quoted twice in the book of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And that sums up the book of Judges, and that sums up in that one verse, that entire period of God's people. Yet, there was always a remnant. There always has been, and there always will be, I presume. And so, the book of Samuel, by the way, is one book. There's not two books, it's one book. In the Hebrew, Samuel is one book. It was written to be read the whole way through. We've divided it into two, but it is one book and it's one story, and it's intended as to be read as such. But Samuel starts off in this period of seemingly hopelessness. What happened? God's delivered us into Canaan finally after all these years and all that he's done. And yet, the tribe of Benjamin's almost completely wiped out. We're losing ground. Where's the hope? And so we begin with this story of Hannah and the birth of Samuel. And the story begins in chapter 1, verse 1. There was a certain man of Ramathaim-Zophim in the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. In this opening paragraph, we see Hannah, whose name in the Hebrew meant favored one, but yet she had no children. We see a man named Elkanah. He has 2 wives. This is not to justify polygamy. Polygamy was never condoned in the Bible. God said in Genesis 2, the 2 shall become one flesh, not 3 or 5 or 10. Jesus reinforced that in the New Testament. But yet, culturally at this time, generally, if someone took a wife and that wife wasn't able to have children, to bear children, they would take another wife in order to have children. It doesn't make it right. But this is just a record of this person who's just a man and woman just like we are. And now this man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh. Now if you remember, God dwelt in the tabernacle in this time. And the tabernacle at this time was located in Shiloh. And Lord of hosts. We've been talking about Lord of hosts in our study of Zechariah. I think it's Zechariah chapter 8. Lord of hosts is mentioned, I think it was 18 times. I forget the number. But this is the first time in the Bible that Lord of hosts is used. And how significant and how fitting. Because this book, the book of Samuel, the whole purpose of this book is to justify the kingship of David and that the ultimate king of Israel would come from the Davidic line. Lord of hosts, Lord of heaven's armies, the commander-in-chief. It's the first time that this name of God has been used. The Lord of hosts at Shiloh were the 2 sons of Eli. Hophni and Phinehas were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. And so it went year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? To appreciate Hannah's prayers, we have to appreciate just how bad of a situation this really was for Hannah. Hannah was barren. And especially at this time and in this culture, bearing a child was the main function of a woman. That was her primary purpose in life, was to bear a child and to provide a fruitful womb for her husband. And if you were barren, there was all sorts of social shaming that revolved around that we can't understate how harsh it probably was. And if that wasn't bad enough, here we have Peninnah, Hannah's sister wife, who, rather than having compassion on Hannah and her situation, gloats in her misfortune. And so Hannah's whole life, her dreams and hopes for the future of having a child and what that child may become one day. And she had a vision for what she hoped her kids could become one day, and we see that in her first prayer. All of that was gone. And she rather had to sit on the sidelines and watch her husband, whom she loved, have children with another woman that he married. is an awful situation. It reminds us of one problem with polygamy, and this isn't the only place in the Bible that we see that. But Hannah is struggling in a real way. And I'll tell you that it has been hard for me to relate, A, because I'm not a woman, and B, because our family hasn't experienced infertility. But we know people that have, and many of our number here have, and have family members who have. And those of you who have know what not only a physical trial that is, but an emotional, spiritual, financial trial that is. And then you get into adoption and the whole world that is. This is a real trial. And as we continue in verse 9, after they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hannah rose. And now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She, that is Hannah, was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, O great commander of the heaven's armies, ruler of those spiritual angelic beings whom you send out into the heavens and beyond to achieve your holy task, I'm proclaiming that you are that God, and God, if you can do all of that, and surely you and you alone can allow me and enable me to bear a child. If you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. Hannah desperately wanted a child. But she didn't just want a child. She asked for a son. And not only a son, but a son that she had a vision and a hope that the Lord could use in a very special way to accomplish his holy task in whatever capacity he was able to serve. This vow that she vows typifies the Nazirite vow, which is found in Numbers chapter 6, where anyone, man or woman, could devote themselves, commit themselves to the Lord's service for any amount of time. This was completely voluntary. This was not commanded. And yet it certainly was never commanded that you should do this by birth or commit your children to this service from birth for all the days of their life. This is a very special vow. It's a very overly generous offering and votive offering that Hannah is making here with her child. And verse 12 says, as she continued praying, persistence in prayer, before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart, only her lips moved, and her voice was not heard. Does God hear silent prayers? You bet. And therefore Eli took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, how long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you. But Hannah answered, no, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I've drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I've been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. And then Eli answered, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. And she said, let your servant find favor in your eyes. And then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. All these years, Hannah was incredibly anxious, worried, distressed, weeping, not eating, completely miserable. And yet, on this day at the tabernacle in Shiloh, that all changed. she walked away from the tabernacle that day with a peace that she hadn't known for who knows how many years. Why? Was it the comforting words of Eli, the high priest? Maybe. It's probably a part of it. What changed her entire demeanor and her whole life on this day? She still didn't have a child. When we worry, when we're anxious, we're really saying that, God, I don't really know if I can trust you with this or not. But yet, when life is more than we can bear, we have to give our worry to God. And I believe that is what changed Hannah's demeanor this day. That is what brought Hannah out of this great distressing situation, because she had taken this weight that she had been carrying around for years, whether it was the ridicule from the society or Peninnah, maybe shaming herself, frustrated with herself. She said, Lord, I can't take this anymore. I've been brought to my knees. And I'm taking this weight of the world on my shoulders and I'm giving it to you. We sing the song, how many songs talking about this same subject? I cannot bear the load of life unaided. Verse 19 says, they rose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord. And then they went back to their house at Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah, his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son. And she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked him from the Lord. The Lord remembered her. She was worried that God had forgotten her. But the truth is, God had never forgotten about her. The truth is, God was always with her. But God was using this trial. God had closed her womb. He had created this trial. But things aren't always as they seem, according to our worldly perspective. And God uses trials to test us. God uses trials to bring us to a greater sense and a greater realization of our utter dependence on Him. God told the children of Israel through the language of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 8, at the base of Mount Pisgah, He said, the reason that the Lord led you through the wilderness for 40 years was to test you, to see what was in your heart, and to know whether you'd keep His commandment or not. And He humbled you, and He let you hunger. He let you hunger. And sometimes in life we wish it wasn't so. We wish there was some other way that we could learn obedience other than what God puts us through. But it's because He loves us. And Jesus Himself had to learn obedience through suffering. And I can't explain that. The man Elkanah, verse 21, and all his house went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and to pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, as soon as the child is weaned, I will bring him, so that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and dwell there forever. Elkanah, her husband, said to her, do what seems best to you. Wait until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord establish His word. So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine. And she brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. And the child was young. And they slaughtered the bull, and they brought the child to Eli. And she said, "O my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who is standing here in your presence, praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord." Hannah presented Samuel to the priest, Eli. This was a principle rooted in Exodus chapter 13. It was something we see later that Mary and Joseph presented Jesus at the temple, and it was all about reminding the child and the generation and the parents and everybody else of the Passover. And Exodus 13, I'm not going to turn there for sake of time, but Exodus 13 tells all about it. The firstborn of the animals, the firstborn of the flock that were male, were burned on the altar. They belonged to God. But the firstborn of son, your firstborn child who is a son, you redeem. So you would present your child to the priest, and you would pay 5 shekels of silver to buy your child back. And if you didn't have 5 shekels of silver, there were provisions that were made. Mary and Joseph gave 2 turtle doves and a pigeon. But this was something that Hannah didn't have to do. Why did she do it? She had made a vow. She had to keep her end of the vow. She could have not kept her end of the vow. It wouldn't have been that uncommon in the time period she was living, maybe the time period we're living. But Hannah gave beyond what was asked of her, beyond what was required of her, not even just in Samuel, not to belittle that, but even in the 3-year-old bull and an ephah of flour and a skin of wine. That was way beyond anything that was asked of her. And she had outs. Elkanah, her husband, could have canceled her vow. He had the right to do that as her husband, but he didn't do it. Elkanah gave his son also in Samuel. Why did she do it? Gave all that she had in her only son. She wasn't guaranteed another child. I would suggest that Hannah, through her trial of infertility, had realized that her joy, her identity, her fulfillment wasn't in having a child. It wasn't in having a son. It wasn't in Samuel. It wasn't in any physical blessing. Hannah had realized to look at life with an eternal perspective. And Hannah realized through the trial that her strength and her joy was in God. And so she could depart from the things of this world because of something greater. And she talks about that in her second prayer in chapter 2. And so, for the scripture reading, I had read Jerry, Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 14. Y'all may be wondering why Ecclesiastes, but in the day of prosperity be joyful, and in the day of adversity consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. We're to keep our eyes on God. God wants us to trust him, and sometimes he brings us low in order for us to realize and in order to live in joy regardless of our circumstances. And that's a hard lesson. And all these years, Hannah praying and waiting on God to respond, waiting on God to act. And yet, in the Hebrew, the word for wait and the idea, the concept of waiting was tying. It was taking 2 threads and intertwining them. It was an active waiting. It wasn't sitting around idly by watching something to fall out of the cloud. There was action in waiting. And the idea was in the intertwining is that it would become a cord that couldn't be broken. Hannah had intertwined her heart with God's. And when she came through the trial, there was a cord there that could not be broken. And so we have her second prayer, which is her most well-known prayer. I'm going to read Hannah's second prayer and give a brief invitation, and the lesson will be yours. Chapter 2 of 1 Samuel says, "And Hannah prayed and said, My heart exults in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. The Lord brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts up the needy from the ash heap, to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed." Hannah's heart exalted in God. Hannah found her strength in God. And through the testing, the Lord found out what was in Hannah's heart, and we see what was in Hannah's heart. And so how about us? Where do we find our fulfillment? Where does our heart exalt? And where do we find our strength? If you're listening this morning and you feel that you need to present yourself before the Lord, to commit your life to God in the service of his holy will, that can start today. Or if you're here and you maybe have been reminded of the power of prayer, and would like to call upon the collective prayer of the assembly here to restore in you the joy of his salvation, would you please make that known while together we stand and sing.